Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, this is the Backlog, and this week is all about Metroid Dread. We're going to be doing this in two parts. The first talking about general gameplay elements, discussing stuff that's common in Metroid, things that can be assumed, stuff that's within the first hour of gameplay or was shown off in a trailer, though I might still avoid some of that, and whether or not the game is good. The second will be about the nitty-gritty of the story, presentation, and about some specific parts of the game that are much later in, though that will be its own video, so look forward to a part 2 if you've already cleared the game. So, assuming that not everyone who sees this will have also watched my last episode, let's go over the story basics. This is Metroid 5, so if we prioritize remakes, it goes Zero Mission, Samus Returns, Super, Fusion, and now finally Dread. Consider the spin-offs as supplemental or bonus games. Dread starts out explaining what Metroids are, artificially produced energy vampires created by the Chozo, an avian race of warriors and scientists, to serve as a predator to the X-Parasite. It then tells you about the X, a virus-like goo organism that attaches itself to a victim to either possess or absorb them, copying their DNA so that they can replicate them in a fairly perverted and oftentimes more powerful form. It goes briefly over how in Fusion, Samus encountered them and supposedly wiped them out, which brings us to present. A video of an X in the wild on planet ZDR has surfaced. The Federation sends 7 EMMI, nigh indestructible research robots, to the planet to look into it, but they soon go dark. While their relationship has been somewhat tenuous of late, they then enlist Samus, as perhaps the only person immune to the X, to investigate and possibly deal with the threat. Samus heads to the planet, after which, being warned by her computer, Adam, that the risk far exceeds the reward, loses contact with him as she heads deep beneath the surface. There, she is assaulted by a Chozo warrior, and the encounter leaves her suit with largely depowered functions, and the way back to the surface is destroyed. The game starts with Samus then in a much more volatile situation than she anticipated, with the goal of getting back to her ship. As an aside, I do enjoy how often Metroid game gives a reason for Samus losing her powers. Some might roll their eyes and think, here we go again, with how often it happens, but I'd find it even more questionable if we just started the game at 0 when in the last we ended as a weapons factory, pretty much. When I start a direct sequel to an RPG back at level 1, or an adventure game where all my previous equipment is mysteriously missing, I always raise an eyebrow, so I appreciate Metroid for marrying the narrative to the gameplay and not just counting on us to assume that she left her space jump boots in her other suit or something. Now for game mechanics. As you would expect, the game is a Metroidvania. That means a platformer with a large emphasis on exploration, you revisiting previous areas after you either gain new abilities or things change to discover new paths, areas, and upgrades. You start off with your arm cannon, a small missile capacity, jump, wall jump, slide, and melee counter. This gives you a lot of utility right away. While most of these moves are standard, at least for a Metroid, 2 are worth taking special note of. First is the slide. Samus normally needs the Morph Ball to slip into crevices, but since you don't get that right away, this gives you a way to get into some areas you wouldn't be able to otherwise. It's also a clever way of limiting you, since you can slide only into tight spots that are ground level, creating a clear difference what holes are for now and which are for later, and also creates one-way paths, as some of the crevices are floor level on some sides of a wall, but not on the other. It also serves as a good escape in a pinch, letting you either slide under enemies or into another section. Then there's the melee counter. This was introduced in Samus Returns for the 3DS, the remake of Metroid 2. When some enemies physically attack you, there will be a brief flash, which, if you react in time to, will let you parry the move, putting them off guard. You will then auto-target the enemy, and if you shoot them quickly, you pretty much eviscerate them and get better drops. The window for doing this is pretty reasonable. You can pull it off pretty well with timing, or, if yours is bad, most are predictable enough that you can probably still pull it off. It's super fun to do, and when you do it successfully, it feels really good and skilled. It works a bit differently on EMMIs and bosses, but they get their own discussion, so we'll put them aside for now. As for the rest of the abilities Samus unlocks, most of the previous Metroid stuff is here, some of them slightly altered. Some you get from taking down bosses, and some you get by discovering Chozo statues, as is the norm. The weird part is the order and pace you get them in. Most Metroid titles follow a typical order you get stuff, but this one switches things up a bit. The main standout is how the Morph Ball is not the first thing you find. While I won't say what is, I will say it takes a bit, unlike the first Metroid game where I think you literally just needed to go one screen to the left to get the equip. It can be maddening just going through the first part of the game, seeing all the places you could fit with the ball, and not knowing just when you'll find it. The other odd part is how often you get new powers, in that there's no consistency at all. Normally you'd get new stuff at a fairly regular interval, but here it can be pretty feast or famine. I think at one point, I went almost an hour without anything new. Then, at another, I got a new upgrade about 5 minutes after the last. It almost gives you a sense of whiplash as you recall all the new places you saw that you can now go with your new toy, only to have to also include all the other side paths that you can get to with your even newer toy. That said, with each additional skill unlocked, a significant amount of stuff opens up to you. I remember early on especially thinking every time I got something, this changes everything. Okay, but now this changes everything. Yeah, but with this more than anything, everything is changed. Each one feels important and like a major step forward, which is huge for a Metroidvania. One of the worst things that can happen would be getting a new power and being underwhelmed or having no idea if you'll ever even need to use it. A sense of progression is key. Samus's wide range of abilities and moves, though, does lead to one of the few problems I had with the game, and that is just how many functions you have to keep track of. Sure, the plus and minus are your standard pause and option menus, but beyond that, your face buttons are for jumping, shooting, melee, and dash, your shoulders slide, manual aim, switch to missiles, and switch to grapple. The D-pad can play with the map and activate some Aeon abilities, and even pressing in some of the control sticks do stuff. This is a lot to keep track of, and it can be easy to forget some things as you use them less and less, only for them to suddenly be relevant again. There was one boss that I couldn't jump over that backed me into a corner and just beat me to death that I couldn't figure out until I remembered that, oh wait, you can slide under some enemies, which I hadn't needed to do in hours, so it completely slipped my mind. Some of these functions also need to be used in conjunction, such as needing to press down the manual aim, point with the stick, press the grapple button, and then press and hold the fire button, which, in case you weren't counting, is 4 things to do at once. As for the main joystick, you use it to move, duck, or switch to Morph Ball, grab ledges, cling to walls, and do basic aiming. This led to a lot of flubbed inputs and frustration in some high-stakes situations. That said, I do have a tendency to overthink what I'm doing, and I just kind of play through the game without a lot of time spent practicing specific things, so I'm sure someone much more skilled than me would just tell me to get good, which could very well be the solution. I'm sure right now people are honing their skills and putting out speed runs with divine control, so I don't think this will be much of a problem for more committed players. For the average person though, I think it will definitely take some getting used to. To help compensate though, some upgrades are simplified, overwriting previous powers instead of just supplementing them. While new armor always replaces the old, and in most Metroid games, new arm cannon upgrades either stack or replace the previous ones altogether as it gets better, here missiles get progressively better, as opposed to, say, super missiles having separate ammo or requiring an additional button prompt to be queued up and expend more ammo. With as many controls as you have to juggle, this is largely appreciated. As for the exploration angle, it's good. You get a map that you fill out as you travel through areas, and if you find the map room, you get a vague idea of the area's format, which you can use to plot a path. As you fill out the map, things get more clearly labeled, and they even make sections with secrets glow so you know where to look more carefully. You can also put markers on the map if there's something you don't want to forget, which is super helpful given that you'll constantly be seeing stuff you could do if you had just the right ability. Save stations are scattered around pretty liberally, so it's easy to find one, and there's a lot of temporary autosaves scattered about in between as well, so you don't lose much progress often. As for the main storyline, the game steers you pretty well with where you need to go, either putting new accessible stuff in your path or making subtle changes to the environment to bring your attention to something new. There are some points where it's easy to get lost or not know what to do next, either due to missing a cue or just being overwhelmed at all the possible places to explore as more and more opens up, but even if you stumble around, you can normally find a helpful power-up or two to make it worth your while. And sometimes you stumble upon the way forward accidentally. There was one point where I remembered an upgrade that I found the ability I needed to get for, and I wandered back that way thinking I was going all script. When I did, I found an attached path that I followed and found a mechanism that opened up a set of doors, which I thought would just open up more optional paths and upgrades for me. Instead, it damaged the area's infrastructure, everything went on fire, my way back was blocked, and I had to rush through the area. This led to a new ability, another section of the level, another new power, and finally a major boss battle before I got back to where I left what I thought was the main path. The whole time I just questioned whether I had somehow sequence broke and whether I would get stuck, but when I got back to the main path, everything I had found fit nicely into what I thought was where I was supposed to be going, and I was able to advance. Conversely, there were other times where I did get lost, such as the time where I didn't notice a panel I was supposed to stand on and ran right by it several times. Then there was another time when there was a crevice I didn't bother going into because I thought I needed the grapple beam to fling something into it. After wandering around for the better part of an hour, I came back, rolled into it, and some panels fell away to drop me into the room below. While I was fairly annoyed and frustrated at the time, I blamed most of these failures on myself, either not being observant or clever enough, or being too dismissive. The game is intuitive enough that you can figure your way forward in most situations, and when not, well, the internet does exist. I avoided the temptation to look up a walkthrough several times, so getting through it on your own power is quite doable. The last thing to discuss that's specifically mechanics would be, I guess, the power-ups and enemy drops. In concern to the latter, basic enemies will drop health and ammo refills. Bosses do the same when you either perform a counter or clear a phase. The game isn't super stingy with them, and it lets you avoid many stupid deaths and use your missiles much more liberally. As long as you're not constantly whiffing shots or purposefully shooting the floor or something, you can default to missiles even in boss situations, which is further helped by the capacity upgrades you find by exploring the map. You can get missile expansions to increase how many you can carry, small expansions giving you an additional 2, and the full one giving you another 10. I ended the game being able to hold well over 100 of the suckers. Then there's the energy tanks. A full one gives you another 100 health, whereas if you get an energy part, you need 4 to form a full tank. A shame that they didn't just give you a partial upgrade, like with the missile expansions, to give you chunks of 25 health at a time, but what can you do? There's also amiibo support. The Samus one sold with Dread giving you an extra permanent energy tank and refilling your health once per day, and the EMMI giving you a full missile expansion and refilling them once per day. While I do have both, I didn't use either since it would have felt like paying to win, heck, kinda like cheating, but if I do a second playthrough, I might use them then, since it will likely be a more casual run. Just thought I'd mention. One of the elements that are worth talking about on their own are the EMMI. After all, they were part of the announcement trailer and factor very heavily into the game. They are the incredibly durable research robots sent to ZDR to investigate the X, but now seem intent on dispatching Samus instead. There are 7 of them scattered throughout their various zones, and they seem to be the inspiration for the title Dread. They are physically imposing, towering over Samus when fully erect. While vaguely humanoid, they have elongated limbs with extra joints. Despite being able to walk bipedal, they mostly travel about on all fours, crawling along floors, walls, ceilings, and vents, and some of them also twist themselves around in disturbing ways like a contortionist. They are relentless in their pursuit of Samus, tracking her by sound and possessing different abilities that you need to learn how to contend with. If they catch you, it's insta-death unless you manage to counter them. They fill you with panic and are the reason many are calling Metroid Dread a horror game. I hate to say it, but they do their job almost too well. First is how hard they are to counter. When they catch you, you have two chances to fight them off and temporarily stun them. The first when they attempt to grab you, the second right before they skewer you. While the melee counter normally has a pretty reasonable window, here they are much narrower. I think I heard someone say it was about 1/10 of a second, which is an insane reaction time. They also vary the timing, so you can't just predict when they're going to strike. You need to have laser focus. At first I couldn't do this at all, and by the end I could occasionally do it, which is still pretty brutal. Second, as you might expect from a video game, they get progressively more aggressive and difficult with their abilities. One of the later ones can end you with little more than a twitch of its non-existent eyebrow. Third, sometimes the ways you're supposed to avoid them just plain don't work. One of the early upgrades you get lets you turn invisible. You can turn that on, be standing completely still in a spot that the enemy has no reason to go, and they'll still just walk into you, discovering you upon impact. You can also avoid detection, stand perfectly still, waiting for them to move on, then take 2 steps and instantly it detects you and is on your butt. Sometimes they're also just right around the corner when you enter the area, giving you no time to study your surroundings, and I can't even tell if this is random or not. And lastly, sometimes you just have very little room to navigate through. Some of the areas you have to maneuver around them in are little more than hallways, and combined with some of the other issues, it can be nigh impossible to get around the EMMI. In some of the later sections, the only way I got past was by somehow, miraculously, pulling off 2 counters in a row while running around like a woman possessed. These could make me so miserable that I actively thought about how I wasn't having fun. That said, these sections are redeemed by a few things. First are just how short most of the stints are. While the EMMI's territories are massive, they are typically divvied up into segments so that you only have to escape through 2 or 3 screens at a time. Combine that with the very generous temporary saves that reset you to just before you enter through the EMMI door, and you lose very little progress and get back into the action quickly. Then there's just how cool it feels to get through these sections. You get through a section, you feel good. You counter an EMMI, you feel like a god, little g. You actually manage to take one out, and you feel like a god, capital G. It might just be the greatest high in the game, nay, the world. If they had this feeling in drug form, I would be an addict. And frustrations aside, it really does hit all the right beats for a more panic-inducing game. I played Bendy and the Ink Machine a year or so ago, and I was just so bored with the supposed horror elements. If I got caught by the supposedly spooky monster chasing me, I was mildly inconvenienced and sent back to a checkpoint without any actual loss of progress. At times I even made a bunch of noise to attract the beast so that I could just get warped to one of those locations. Here though, it's tension, tension, tension. While not much is lost when you die, nothing is gained either, so you're desperate to get through the area. It doesn't take much to set the EMMI off, so even if you do everything right, you never feel safe. And when they do back you into the corner, you know what's coming, but the timing is still unpredictable, and you can forget to breathe as you hyper-focus on the exact millisecond you had to strike back. All this is why the EMMIs are probably both my most hated and most loved part of the experience. The game has a ton of other bosses, more so than I even realized as I was going through it. After you take one down, a grayed out icon appears on the map showing the name and location of where you fought them. Several of them, to me at least, seemed like either sub-bosses or just really hardy enemies, so I was surprised that they were considered full bosses. It did make me feel a lot better though when I died a few times on some of them. Well, most of them. I'd say the large, room-filling bosses in particular managed to kill me around 6 times each. On the bosses themselves though, most, if not all, have attack patterns that you can learn and use to truly master the encounters. I remember one fight in particular where, on the first encounter, I was completely ripped apart, but when I did manage to actually beat it, I got through the whole first phase of the fight, taking damage only once. I'm reminded of Mega Man and Cuphead, with the seemingly insurmountable challenges that end up being a lot more doable once you get the ins and outs of a level or fight down. It's a very cool feeling. Many of them also feature the use of the melee counter. Some bosses require them as a finisher move, leading to a brutal takedown to close out a fight. Others, most notably the larger bosses, Use them to initiate a cinematic sequence where Samus engages them in an impressive display of strength or acrobatics, and you deal damage as quickly as you can hit the fire button. The counters on bosses seem to have even more generous windows than the regular enemies, perhaps because of how integral they are to a fight, and also because missing them can drag them out considerably. Plus, if you don't get them, you miss out on some pretty incredible looking sequences, so this was probably a smart design choice. Overall, the boss fights are very fun and satisfying to complete, even if not all of them net you a new ability. A thing I find interesting about them is that it seems like what boss someone finds the most challenging varies from person to person. I saw a topic on GameFAQs complaining about how the final boss wasn't the most challenging, and several people chimed in disagreeing and asking which fight they thought was worse, while others voiced their own personal demons. It demonstrates how people can have very different experiences with the same game, and each individual playthrough can be deeply personal. Character design is kind of a mixed bag, in my opinion. A lot of the common enemies can be kinda boring. There's the slug that's just kind of a brown moving blob, the bat sorta thing that looks like something made out of wet silly putty, the weird little indistinct grubs that run along the ground, the wall pimples with the 4 claws that are stuck to the walls, and also the hunks of rock with a glowy core that just floats across the ceiling firing lasers. Some of the later game fauna do have some pretty groovy looks, but early on I think they look pretty lackluster. Maybe I just sat too far back from the TV to see the nitty-gritty details. I kinda wonder if I'm missing something, especially when I contrast them against the bosses and main characters. Samus has a new suit this time around. It seems to be somewhere between the original Chozo battlesuit and the fusion suit, with a lot of tiny details that they honestly could have taken the easy way out and just polished over with a smooth one-piece texture. They do a good job of making it look recognizable as what Samus wears, yet make it distinct enough that someone who hasn't played Dread but is familiar with the rest of the series would realize that it's something unique. It's also got its own color scheme that looks really nice. Then there's the Chozo that shows up in the opening cutscene. Samus was gifted a Chozo battlesuit that was customized for her, and here we see what perhaps a more typical one looks like. It has just a very basic coloration, showing that it was designed more for function than appearance. The hands and feet have a more talon-like appearance, and the beak is also much more prominent. It has a big, dumbass arm cannon that seems over the top, and also a strange, samurai-esque decoration on the helmet underlying their warrior prowess. It also has a cape with some scarf-like tassels over the shoulders, possibly signifying importance. While not the most overstated design, it does tell you a lot. There are also the EMMI, which we talked about earlier. They're very sleek, and regardless of the color scheme, they all give off a plastic, very artificial appearance, contrasting with the strange wild fauna you encounter in the rest of the game. Combine that with their towering full height, giant claws, single red glowing eye, elongated limbs, and disturbing movements, and they really are unnerving and impart a sense of, dare I say, dread. There are also the bosses themselves, many of them looking bizarre and unearthly. One of the first, that was shown off as part of the marketing, has a strange, bone-like face with too many eyes, 2 massive forearms that it lugs itself around on, a massive tail that acts somewhere between a rattlesnake and a scorpion, and a backside with parts that look like they shouldn't be on the outside, making you ask just what you're looking at. Then there's one boss later on that I won't go into the specifics, other than to say that in the second stage, it seemed to fire maggots and acidic pus from an open sore at you, making for a very uncomfortable but memorable experience. While some basic early enemies may feel a little boring, overall, I'd say the game has a strong sense of style, ones that are disturbing and unpleasant to look at, but in a very good way. A few other little points I want to talk on are the music and graphics. As for the music, there's honestly not a lot that sticks in my head. What's there is largely atmospheric, adding to the overall mood and feel of the game, rather than something that's super memorable. While I really would have loved a good toe tapper that be stuck in my head for the next 2 months, what is there works. It directs the move, it keeps the pace, and it gives the player an idea of what to expect. Most of the Metroid tracks that I do know are from Smash, and some of those might have been punched up for a fighting game, so it's really not all that surprising, I suppose. The 2 tracks that do sometimes come to mind are the ones for the EMMI area. The normal one can hardly be called a song, being mostly just the beeps and clicks of the EMMI, along with some odd noises from the machinery, though due to a combination of how often I heard it and how intensely I would listen to hear how close the EMMI was and if it had sensed me, baked the track into my brain. Then once I was spotted and something that encapsulated a feeling of dread played, which forced me into a mode of hyperfocus as I looked for an escape route and also kept trying to keep my pursuer at a distance, which made the track stay with me as well. The soundtrack was never really a selling point for me on Metroid games though, so I'm not really disappointed. As for the graphics, I think they look great. I might have gotten off my initial high with the game, and I don't think I call it the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen anymore. After all, it is on the Switch, but I am still quite pleased with how it looks. While I got a new Switch OLED, I played the whole thing docked, so I can only say how it looked on the TV. Refer back to what I said about character designs, with some of the enemies looking kinda meh or blah, but the bosses really stood out and it left an impression. The environments look nice, and there's a lot of cool details in the background. Plus, there's cool little effects, like bits of heat or chill creeping out of doors leading to areas with extreme temperatures, and it feels like they put a lot of work into making everything look good and clear, and to get the most out of the Switch hardware. The cutscenes in particular are quite stunning. Now on to game length, since that can be a make or break for some people. According to How Long to Beat, the average playtime is 8.5 hours. My end screen told me it took just under 9 hours. This is a bit misleading though, because looking into it more, it seems that things like game overs, cutscenes, and menus don't count towards your overall time. Chances are it probably took me somewhere between 10 and 12 hours total to finish. It would have taken me even longer if I had taken the time to go for 100% completion. Sure, I did do one last run around for a few extra power-ups, but I think it would have taken around another 2 hours had I gone all the way. In addition to that, it always felt like I had played a lot longer than I did when I sat down. That wasn't because I was bored and it was a slog, but because of just how much is packed into my hours of gameplay. You can go through 3 different biomes, collect 4 different power-ups, get 2 new upgrades, and die to an enemy over a dozen times, and clock it in at just under 50 minutes. When you accomplish so much though, it's easy to feel like it was well over an hour. Even after you beat the game, hard mode opens up, which, while I shudder to think about what that'd be like, does add replay value. There's also bonus art you can unlock in the gallery if you do a run quickly enough, so even with the relatively short average playtime, you can get a lot out of this game, if it's really your thing. And if not, maybe it'll end up taking you a lot longer than most to get through it even once. Overall, I really love this game. It's fun and it felt really great when I found the next way forward, figured out how to progress, found a hidden item, or took down a particularly challenging boss. I was also super interested in the story. My curiosity was piqued in the intro, then took more of a backseat as gameplay took center stage. When it came back to the forefront though, I got really invested and was impressed by just how it was handled. Even though I didn't want the game to end, I was desperate to find out how everything concluded. Rewatching some of the early scenes also brought to my attention some small details that I hadn't noticed the first time, reinforcing just how carefully it was directed. Metroid Dread gets my highest recommendation. While knowledge of other Metroid titles will enhance the experience, it's not required, so you can jump right in. Most of the things I complained about aren't deal breakers, and with some practice, most players should be able to overcome them. The only real caveat might be the difficulty. It is pretty darn hard, and I can see some people just not being able to get through it. For puzzles and paths, a walkway can get you past them, but for some of the maneuvers and fights, it might be a bit much for some players. EMMIs can be relentless, and they only get more ruthless. Some bosses will continually beat you into the dirt. If you can manage, or even relish a challenge though, this game is absolutely worth the struggle. One last tidbit I wanted to talk about was the Kotaku thing. In case you're unaware, the site posted an article about how emulators already have pirated copies up online. This in itself is fair, I guess. It is news. The part that bugged me though was they mentioned several providers of the copies. I feel like it'd be the equivalent of publishing an article on illicit drug sales and then capping off the article with telling your audience a few hotspot locations where they could pick some up for themselves, along with a subtext saying how fun drugs are. I thought about not including this here since while I'm not giving you directions to the emulators, I am kind of giving directions to the directions, but I'm doing it for a few reasons. First, Most people know that emulators exist, and even more are probably familiar with Kotaku, so I really doubt my 7 subscriber channel is going to bring this to anyone's attention. Second, I'm going to take this time to make a plea. While most of the people who reacted to the article were very critical of it, there were a few that made the argument that Nintendo is a billion-dollar company and doesn't need your money. And they're right. Even if we ignore the debate on whether stealing in general is wrong, which we could certainly talk about, it is true that Nintendo has a crap ton of money, and even when they release an absolute bomb of a console, they still manage to get by fine. That said, while Nintendo doesn't need your money, Metroid does. According to sales charts, even the best-selling title hasn't broken 3 million sales, and there's even a mainline title in the mix that got only around 500,000. Even if they were all to do well enough to justify their existence, ask yourself this. If you could release a Metroid game and make a bit of profit, or do some oddball badminton game and make millions by slapping Mario on the title, which are you going to put resources into? Samus Returns didn't do so hot, despite it being a pretty stellar game and it being on the 3DS with a huge install base. Maybe it was due to resentment from them taking down a fan-made Metroid 2 remake. Maybe it was just too close to the Switch drop, but regardless, them trying to bring back 2D Metroid didn't turn out so hot, yet they went forward with Dread anyway. There was some art for Dread's story in Samus Returns, so maybe it was too far along to cancel, but here we are, at a turning point. If this game does not sell, it might be quite some time before we get another 2D Metroid, if ever again. And I shudder to think what would happen if Prime 4 doesn't move units either. One of the biggest problems with Nintendo is that they have so many great and beloved properties, and they only make games for about a half dozen of them. Fire Emblem was in a similar boat to Metroid, and now it gets regular new installments. Good sales for this game could be huge for the series. While this might be jumping the gun, maybe if more of these oddballs forgotten franchises started selling, they might give some of the other ones that have seen similar hiatuses a chance. I'm sure a few come to mind. So I guess what I'm asking is, if you want to play this game, either upon my suggestion or on your own inclination, please, please, please consider buying a copy. I don't care if it makes me look like a Nintendo shill. Hell, in many ways I probably am. I just really love this game and want to see more, so please, do it for yourself. Do it for me. Heck, do it for Arlo. You know, that blue Muppet-looking guy. He loves Metroid. Also Pikmin if you want to buy some copies of that. Cause yeah, Nintendo isn't our friend. They don't need our money to stay afloat. Mario and Zelda will always carry them, but we can't keep complaining about them letting their properties die and then not support those series when we have the chance. And with that, I'd like to say thanks for watching, maybe subscribe if you enjoy this sort of thing, and if you played through Dread, keep an eye out for another video coming in the next few days with plot discussion and big spoilers. But only if you've gotten to those credits. Later.